Dubrow Suspicion Files.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are sailing straight into one of maritime history's most enduring, and I think it's fair to say, most heavily mythologized mysteries. We're talking about the vanishing of the 3 lighthouse keepers from the Flannan Isles in December of 1900.
Yeah, and it's a story that everyone thinks they know. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur. For over a century, their story has just been completely clouded by, well, sensationalism.
Right, all the folklore, the literary inventions.
Exactly. The details you always hear, the stopped clock, the allegedly untouched meal, they've become, part of the public imagination. They suggest something. Something spectral or deeply psychological happened out there.
Okay, so let's unpack this because that's our mission for this deep dive. We're aiming for an expert-level reconstruction. We're going to dive straight into the archival reality.
Right, using the primary sources.
Exactly. We're talking about evidence from the Northern Lighthouse Board, the NLB, their own records, plus rigorous meteorological data and modern oceanographic science.
We're basically stripping away a century of fiction to get to the stark and what is, the highly probable reality of this tragedy.
And we want to show you, the listener, how a really careful analysis of the engineering, the geography, and just basic human behavior, it leaves only one rational conclusion.
And it's a conclusion that is, I think, maybe more terrifying than any ghost story.
Before we get to the facts, though, we have to set the stage. I mean, the location is everything here. The Flannan Isles.
The Seven Hunters, they were often called.
Yeah, the Seven Hunters. They're about 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, right on the precipitous edge of the continental shelf. This is where the deep Atlantic just smashes into the shallower Hebridean seafloor.
It is a terrifying location. Eilean Moor, which is the largest of these rocky outcrops, it barely rises 289 feet above the ocean. It's just this lonely pinnacle.
And this site was chosen because it was absolutely critical for navigation.
But it represents this physical collision point. On one hand, you have the rational, almost arrogant engineering of the late Victorian era.
Peak confidence in technology.
Total confidence.
Yeah.
And that confidence confronted the absolute indifferent elemental forces of the North Atlantic.
And the lighthouse itself, I mean, when it was finally lit for the first time, and this is an incredible coincidence, it was exactly 1 year to the day before the tragedy.
December 7th, 1899.
Yeah. It was this massive modern symbol of safety.
It was a beacon of progress. You're talking about a beam of 140,000 candle power, visible for 24 nautical miles. It really represented humanity's attempt to master the darkness and chaos of the sea.
And yet the disappearance of these 3 experienced, conscientious men, leaving behind just those few ambiguous clues, it completely shattered that Victorian ideal of human control.
It did. And to understand what really happened, we have to start with the environment itself.
The islands.
The islands and the machine they built on them.
Yeah.
The environment is, as you said, it's the first and most powerful character in this story. When you look at the Flannan Isles, you are looking at geology that is almost beyond human comprehension. It's Lewis and ice.
Which is what? Exactly.
It's some of the oldest rock on the planet. I mean, billions of years old, carved by unimaginable glacial and wave action into these sheer cliffs and really treacherous inlets.
So we're talking about a place that feels ancient, almost hostile, even before you factor in the weather.
Oh, absolutely. And culturally, you mentioned this. It was regarded by locals as an other country.
An other country. What does that history of superstition add to the mental context for the keepers working out there?
Well, it adds this extra layer of psychological weight. Now, the keepers themselves were modern, educated men. They were servants of the NLB.
Right. They weren't locals steeped in folklore.
Not at all. But the traditions surrounding these islands were deeply rooted in a kind of superstitious dread. Historically, the few people who ever visited, like sheep herders from Lewis, they were bound by these ancient taboos.
What kind of taboos?
They literally refused to call certain objects by their proper names. They had alternate words for things like rocks or the shore. They believed that using the correct word might provoke the genius loci, the spirit or the protector of the place.
That's fascinating. So even as these engineers are installing this pinnacle of science and rationality, the environment itself is just saturated with this history of primal hostility.
Exactly. It sets up this perfect, almost mythological tension.
It suggests that even the most disciplined man might feel a shiver of unease out there alone.
You'd have to. But the lighthouse, of course, was designed to counter all that. It was designed by David Allen Stevenson.
Part of the legendary Stevenson dynasty, the family that built most of Scotland's lighthouses.
The very same. And the construction alone.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned it sounds like a nightmare. It was a massive logistical undertaking.
How long did it take?
4 years. From 1895 to 1899. And you just have to try and imagine the effort. Hauling every single piece of material, every stone block, all the masonry, the glass, the mercury, up these sheer 45-meter cliffs.
How do they even do that?
With cranes and a temporary cable-hauled railway they built just for the construction. The main tower, a 75-foot masonry structure, was situated about 200 feet above sea level.
And that elevation was a deliberate choice for protection, right? They thought they were safe up there.
Utterly safe. They believed that at 200 feet, they were well beyond the reach of the worst the Atlantic could throw at them. And that belief, well, it proved to be tragically flawed.
Okay, let's pivot from the structure to the machine inside it. Because the tower wasn't just a building, it housed this intricate mechanical system. The light itself was unique, wasn't it?
It had a distinct character. 2 flashes in quick succession every 30 seconds, so any ship could identify it.
And to get that massive lens to rotate so smoothly, how did they manage that?
Well, that gets us to the optical apparatus and the incredibly advanced technology at the time. The mercury float system.
The mercury float system. That sounds hazardous.
It was. By the 1890s, when they were building these immense lights with huge heavy glass lenses, engineers like Stevenson knew that traditional roller bearings just created too much friction.
And if the friction was too high, the clockwork mechanism that turns the light would struggle or even stop, especially in a strong wind.
Exactly, would throw the timing off. So they solved it by employing a radical and, as you say, surprisingly toxic method.
Okay, break it down for us.
The entire lens assembly, which was enormous, weighing several tons, was placed on a hollow cast iron ring. This ring then floated in a massive circular trough filled with hundreds of pounds of liquid mercury.
Floating on liquid metal.
That's it. Because mercury is incredibly dense and non-viscous, the friction was reduced to almost zero. The whole massive assembly could be turned by the slightest touch.
That is an astonishing piece of engineering for the time.
It truly is. It meant the delicate clockwork mechanism, powered by just a small weight descending through the tower, could turn the lens with perfect reliability, ensuring the light's character was always correct.
But hundreds of pounds of liquid mercury in an enclosed masonry tower. I mean, that immediately raises red flags about health, doesn't it? This must have been a constant occupational hazard.
Oh, a huge one. It absolutely was. Mercury vapor is odorless, it's colorless, it's incredibly insidious. Keepers, even those on short shifts, were absorbing low-level doses constantly.
And the maintenance must have involved direct contact.
It did. The mercury trough would eventually get contaminated with dust, insects, oxidation, scum. So on a regular basis, they had to perform this maintenance where they would literally strain hundreds of pounds of mercury through fine filters.
What kind of filters?
Often just chamois leather. They were working with their hands right over the exposed liquid metal, inhaling the vapors, probably getting it on their skin.
And that kind of long-term exposure leads to known symptoms.
Yes, chronic symptoms, tremors, neurological issues, sometimes severe psychological changes over time. It was a well-known risk of the job.
I can see immediately why this detail, the mercury, would feed into all the later theories about the keepers going insane or, fighting with each other.
Precisely. It's a very common theory you hear, that they succumbed to acute mercury poisoning, leading to madness or violence.
But that doesn't hold up, does it?
No. As we'll see, it completely fails the forensic test. Mercury poisoning is a chronic condition. It develops over weeks, months, years. It doesn't cause 3 experienced men to suddenly vanish without a trace in the middle of a single workday.
So we have to appreciate this detail for the operational context and the long-term risk it posed, but dismiss it as the trigger for the disappearance on December 15th.
Exactly. The lighthouse was a technological marvel, yes, but one that required hazardous, minute attention. And yet the real fatal flaw wasn't in the optics or the clockwork.
It was in the environment the keepers were forced to interact with every single day.
The landings.
Right, so that's where the environment reasserts its power. But first, we really have to establish who these men were. Because they were not the unstable, volatile figures that later fiction portrayed.
Not in the slightest.
Yeah.
They were professional, highly competent, and reliable NLB servants. You have to understand the keepers were a disciplined service, almost like the military.
So let's look at their profiles. Tell us about the principal keeper, James Ducat.
James Ducat. He was 43 years old, and he was the embodiment of the NLB ideal. a veteran with 22 years of service. He'd served at some of the most remote and challenging stations in Scotland before this posting.
So he was the man in charge.
He was responsible for the logbook, the safety of his colleagues, the proper operation of the light. The superintendent, Robert Muirhead, described him in the official inquiry as steady, reliable. He was promoted to this post specifically because of his exceptional competence.
Okay. And Thomas Marshall, the second assistant.
Marshall was younger. He was 28, physically very capable. And crucially, he had a strong maritime background. He was a seaman before he joined the Lighthouse service.
So he knew the sea. He was no stranger to the dangers of the North Atlantic.
Not at all. He understood waves and weather intimately, and he also had a completely clean record. So any idea of instability or inexperience is just out.
Then there's Donald MacArthur. He's the occasional keeper, and his character is often the one most damaged by the myths.
It really is. He was filling in for a sick colleague, a man named William Ross. MacArthur was an experienced cooper, a barrel maker by trade, but also a seasoned seaman.
So another man who knew the sea.
Yes. And when Superintendent Muirhead interviewed the other staff about MacArthur for his report, he found a clear consensus. Everyone described him as a quiet, steady man.
Which is the complete opposite of the later fictional accounts.
The sensationalist log entries that were fabricated later, the ones that claim MacArthur was weeping or mad with terror, they are a complete and total invention. They're contrary to the man's actual service record and character.
So, to be clear, we have three highly reliable professionals. Their final actions, therefore, must be interpreted through that lens of duty and competence, not some kind of psychological breakdown.
Precisely. Which brings us back to the fatal flaw of the station. Not the men, not the light, the landing vulnerability.
The island required two landing systems, right? Because the swell direction changes constantly.
Yes. You had the east landing, which was generally more protected. That was the primary landing for the relief boat. And then you had the west landing.
The west landing, this is the danger zone. This is the specific location where the tragedy occurred.
It is the trap. The west landing was located in a narrow, steep-sided inlet, a geo, as it's called in Scotland, and it was fully exposed to the fetch of the North Atlantic.
So the full power of the ocean.
But the problem isn't just that it faces the open ocean, it's the geometry of the inlet itself. You gotta picture it.
What does that geometry do to the waves?
It acts as a natural, highly efficient funnel. We should probably spend a moment understanding the physics here, what's called hydraulic amplification.
Okay, what is that?
When these long-carried Atlantic swells, which carry immense momentum from storms hundreds of miles away, enter this narrowing cleft, the water is suddenly confined by sheer rock walls. The volume of water has nowhere to go but up.
So the horizontal energy of the wave is forcefully converted into vertical height, the run-up.
Exactly. And the run-up vastly exceeds the wave height you'd see in the open ocean. A 30-foot wave offshore might become a 70, 80, even 100-foot column of solid water at the head of that geo.
100 feet.
And here's the fact that stunned investigators at the time. The supply railway terminus, where the cranes and the equipment boxes were stored, was situated approximately 80 to 100 feet above sea level.
100 feet up. And they thought that was safe.
They did. But what it means is that even if the open ocean swell was only moderate, the shape of the island itself magnified that force to incredible, impossible-seeming heights, right where the men had to work.
It was a geographical design flaw, a fatal one.
It was. If the men had to go down to secure anything at the West Landing, which was a constant necessity, they were entering a zone where the sea's power was multiplied 10 times over.
And crucially, this station operated without the safety net of modern communication. Tell us again about the communication void in 1900.
There was no wireless telegraphy, no radio. Communication was limited to visual signaling.
Flags or rockets.
Right, a flag for routine things, rockets for immediate distress. And the monitoring system was reliant on just one man, Roderick Mackenzie, a paid gamekeeper on Lewis, who was tasked with observing the light through a powerful telescope from 20 miles away.
And that system was, to put it mildly, catastrophically fragile.
It was entirely reliant on clear weather and human diligence, and Mackenzie failed to report the outage when the light went dark.
What was his reason?
He claimed sea mist, or hair, obscured his view. But this void meant that once the disaster occurred, the world did not know for days. It turned a tragedy into an impenetrable mystery, simply because of that lack of real-time monitoring. So the timeline is our roadmap to the truth. We know the keepers were last visited by Superintendent Muirhead on December 7th. He left them with ample provisions, everything was in order. Then the storm hit.
Right. We know a severe gale struck the Hebrides between December 12th and 14th. There was a major drop in the barometer. And the men were active during this period, keeping the light burning.
They were. But the key thing is, the tragedy didn't happen during the storm's peak.
Which is a critical point. It dismisses the simple idea that they were just blown away by the gale.
Exactly. The critical day was Saturday, December 15th, 1900.
What does the final recorded evidence tell us about the weather that morning?
The keeper's slate. This is where they recorded the routine weather observations before transferring them to the official logbook. It contained the last data, taken at 9:00 a.m. on the 15th.
And what did it say?
The barometer was still low, 29.13 inches, but it was rising. The wind was west-northwest, force 3/4.
Force 3/4. That's a moderate breeze. That's well within the safety tolerance for working outside on the island.
It is. The wind had dropped significantly from gale force. This tells us the men felt safe enough to conduct their regular work. They weren't battened down in terror.
But the wind direction, WNW, that's paramount here, isn't it?
It's everything. It meant that even though the local wind had dropped, the immense, powerful groundswell generated by the previous days of gale force winds was still driving directly, unimpeded, right into that funnel-shaped west landing geo.
So a deceptive calm, masking this profound hydrogeological volatility.
That perfect trap. We also have forensic confirmation from the state of the lighthouse that the daily routine was completed in the forenoon.
What does that mean?
The lamp was trimmed and filled with oil, the giant lens was cleaned and polished, and the kitchen was tidied after their midday meal. This confirms two things. They were functioning rationally, and they disappeared after lunch.
That places the time of disappearance definitively in the afternoon. Probably between, 1:00 p.m. and 4:00 p.m. before sunset.
And we can narrow that window even further thanks to a passing ship. At midnight on December 15th, a steamer called the Archstatter, which was bound for Leith, passed the Flannan Isles.
And their log is critical.
Yes. The officers on watch noted that the Flannan light was not lit. The weather was clear enough for the light to have been visible, but the island was dark.
So that's it, the moment the silence began, and that silence was tragically prolonged because of the technological limitations of the era.
The Archstar had no wireless. They only reported the outage when they docked in Oban or Leith on December 18th. And that report then took a couple of days to filter through the bureaucracy of the NLB.
So the outage was reported far too late to launch any kind of immediate investigation before the scheduled relief mission.
For 10 days, the light stayed dark. And you had Mackenzie's failure to report from Lewis, claiming the light was obscured by mist, which, the more you look at the weather records, seems less and less credible.
His failure compounded the delay.
It did. And the relief vessel, the Hesperus, which was commanded by a Captain Harvey, was already delayed by persistent storms. It couldn't sail until Boxing Day, December 26th.
December 26th. That arrival must have been intensely eerie.
Captain Harvey immediately noted the ominous signs as they approached Eilean Moor. No flag was flying from the mast, which was mandatory protocol.
Right.
No provision boxes were set out on the landing stage for restocking, which was also standard procedure. And worst of all, no keepers visible anywhere to greet the ship.
A strict, military-like breach of protocol.
A huge breach. Harvey sounded the ship's whistle and then fired a signal rocket. And there was just silence.
So they sent a man ashore.
Joseph Moore, the assistant keeper who was on his shore leave rotation, he was the first man to land. He knew the routine, he knew the men personally, and his initial findings are the most critical, unvarnished piece of evidence we possess. Moore's findings, which were documented by Superintendent Muirhead, who arrived shortly after, must be viewed as the definitive forensic record. It's completely separate from the legends that sprang up later.
And we start with the interior of the lighthouse, which speaks of order, not panic.
That's right. The first thing Moore noted was that the fire in the living quarters was out, the ashes cold. That was the first confirmation they had been gone for at least a week.
Okay. And then the kitchen. This is where we can systematically debunk that Marie Celeste myth that everyone quotes.
Yes. Moore found the kitchen was tidy, the utensils were all cleaned and put away. This directly contradicts the sensationalized myth of the half-eaten meal.
So they had clearly finished their lunch, washed up, and tidied everything away.
Exactly. It indicates a normal completion of duties before they went out for their afternoon work.
And what about the famous overturned chair?
Another myth. Moore reported that the chair by the table was sitting upright, exactly where it should be. The scene was one of orderly departure.
And the stopped clock?
It had simply run down. Its mechanism needed to be wound daily. So that just confirmed that there had been no human presence to wind it for days.
What about the logbook?
The official logbook was in its place. The slate nearby contained the routine meteorological observations for the morning of the 15th, just waiting to be transferred. Everything suggested a deliberate, if unexpected, exit.
But within that orderly interior, there was one piece of evidence that screamed of urgency and panic.
The oilskins.
This is the most crucial behavioral clue we have.
It's the linchpin of the whole thing. In the lobby, Moore found 2 sets of oilskins and sea boots were missing from their pegs.
Okay, so whose were missing?
Those belonging to Principal Keeper 𝐏𝐿𝐃 and Second Assistant Marshal. This implies that 𝐏𝐿𝐃 and Marshal planned an excursion outside, likely to perform some essential task in the rough conditions, and they took the necessary foul-weather gear.
Which is just due diligence, normal procedure.
Yes, but Donald MacArthur's set was still hanging there on its peg.
And that is the ultimate anomaly.
It's everything. You have to consider the environment. It's December, it's the North Atlantic, it's cold, there's heavy sea spray everywhere. No experienced keeper, and especially not a former seaman like MacArthur, would ever step 1 foot outside that tower in those conditions without his full protective gear.
Unless he was moving on pure adrenaline or reflex.
Exactly. MacArthur sprinted out of that lighthouse abruptly. He was likely in his indoor jacket, maybe even just his shirt sleeves. It's such a serious breach of protocol that it can only suggest a sudden, desperate reaction to something he witnessed outside.
An immediate, life-threatening emergency involving his colleagues.
Yes. He left the safety of the tower without even thinking about his own protection.
So the interior suggests an orderly completion of tasks, followed by 2 men, 𝐏𝐿𝐃 and Marshal, leaving to do a job, and the third man, MacArthur, running out in a blind panic seconds later.
That's the picture it paints.
Now we move from the interior psychology to the exterior physics. Let's talk about the incontrovertible physical evidence at the West Landing, 80 to 110 feet above sea level.
The physical damage found by Muirhead was beyond dispute, and it defied all normal explanation for wave height at the time. First, the iron railings along the footpath leading down to the West Landing.
What about them?
They were not merely bent, they were displaced, twisted, and torn from their heavy stone sockets.
Tearing iron out of solid rock, that requires just a tremendous sustained force.
And even more astonishingly, a large wooden box. It contained mooring ropes and other equipment, and it had been securely bolted into a crevice at an elevation of 110 feet above sea level. It was gone. The box, the bolts, everything. Missing entirely.
A box securely fastened at 110 feet, just gone. That can't be spray.
No, that has to be green water, solid, high-velocity water. But the most staggering and I think the most often overlooked detail is the stone block.
Tell us about the stone block.
Muirhead reported, and this is in the official NLB document, that a massive stone block, which he estimated to weigh upwards of 2,000 weight, had been dislodged from its setting and carried down onto the concrete path.
We need to put that into context for the listener. 2,000 weight or hundredweight is approximately 1 ton. 2,240 pounds.
It's the weight of a small car.
To move a 1-ton block of masonry high up a cliff, I mean, that requires an immense kinetic energy transfer. Wind cannot do that. Even continuous spray cannot do that.
No. This requires a colossal volume of water, moving at high velocity, reaching an elevation far, far higher than the tower was ever designed to withstand.
And was there evidence of the highest reach of the water?
Yes. Muirhead noted that turf had been ripped away from the very edge of the cliff at an elevation of nearly 200 feet.
200 feet, almost at the base of the lighthouse tower itself.
Right. This damage confirms that Eilean Mor was hit by water masses of an extreme scale, pointing definitively to a meteorological and hydrogeological cause, a catastrophic sea run-up, unique in its violence.
So we have established the forensic facts. We have a tidy interior, a panicked keeper, and clear evidence of water reaching over 100, maybe even 200 feet. We now have to address why this rational conclusion has been so ignored for a century.
Because the mythology is far more compelling. And that mythology was deliberately manufactured. The most pervasive element, this idea of the supposed psychological deterioration of the men, it rests entirely on fake logbook entries.
You hear them quoted constantly. James 𝐏𝐿𝐃 is irritable, Thomas Marshall is weeping. And that final famous line, storm ended, sea calm. God is over all.
It paints this picture of them being driven mad by fear or confinement.
But it's not real.
It is not real. Here's a fact. These entries do not exist in the Northern Lighthouse Board archives. We have the logbook, we have photographs of its pages. It ends routinely on December 13th with weather entries.
And the slate from the 15th
contains only routine weather data. That's it. The entire narrative of psychological collapse is a complete and utter fabrication.
So where did this this powerful piece of atmospheric fiction come from?
It didn't appear until 1929. That's nearly 30 years after the incident. They were published in an American sensationalist publication called True Strange Stories.
A pulp magazine.
Yes, written by an author using the pseudonym Ernest Flannan.
A pulp hoax, designed purely to inject the sensational horror narrative that the actual facts of the case didn't support?
That's all it was. Fallon needed high drama. The real report showed 3 competent men conducting maintenance. Fallon created 3 terrified men praying and descending into madness.
And that final line, God is over all, is just so perfectly mysterious.
It's pure literary invention. It's designed to provide this foreboding, almost supernatural resolution that the bleak reality of indifferent physics refused to offer.
And even before the logbook hoax, there was the poetry, the thing that cemented the false physical imagery. Wilfred Wilson Gibson's 1912 ballad, Flannan Isle.
Gibson's poem is wonderful literature, but it is terrible history. He is the one who introduced the lasting imagery of the overturned chair and the untouched meal. He created that famous classic atmosphere of interrupted life, a psychological vacuum.
So the poet invented the precise details, the half-eaten meal, the overturned chair, that Joseph Moore's initial forensic investigation explicitly contradicted.
Yes. Moore found a clean kitchen and an upright chair. Gibson later admitted that the poem was mostly written from the imagination. But once it was widely anthologized and taught in schools, its dramatic narrative instantly displaced the dry, factual NLB reports.
It speaks volumes about the human psyche, doesn't it? The idea of psychological drama, of some internal conflict, is inherently more satisfying to us than the idea that a random force of nature simply overwhelmed them.
And that desire for a satisfying explanation leads directly to the other theories. The local folklore about spirits and phantom sheepdogs, or the more modern suggestions of aliens or sea monsters.
They're all just coping mechanisms.
That's right. They anthropomorphize nature's indifferent violence. They turn it into something that has an agency, a motive, or a character we can understand and fear in a traditional sense.
Okay, we have the facts, we have the myth. Now let's synthesize all the evidence. The tidy kitchen, MacArthur's panic exit, the 110-foot damage into the official verdict, which is the only hypothesis that fits every single piece of evidence.
The official conclusion, which was delivered by Superintendent Muirhead back in 1901, was that the men were swept away by a severe sea run-up. Modern oceanographic analysis and our understanding of that unique topography fully supports and refines this conclusion.
It was a rogue wave event.
A rogue wave event interacting precisely with the geo's funnel effect.
So let's walk the listener through the likely scenario, minute by minute, on that Saturday afternoon, December 15th.
Okay, the setup. It's early afternoon. The wind has dropped to a moderate breeze, force 3-4, but the long-carried ground swell remains immense, driving in directly from the WNW. The keepers have eaten, they've tidied up, they're functioning normally.
The motivation? Principal keeper James Ducat, he's the veteran, the leader, he's conscientious, and despite the calmer air, he is keenly aware of that remaining ground swell and the potential threat it poses to the vulnerable infrastructure at the West Landing.
He knows that the box expensive mooring ropes and tackle that's secured at 110 feet and the crucial railings along the path are vulnerable. If that gear is lost or the path is damaged, it compromises the entire relief effort and the safety of the tower.
So this isn't a recreational trip down to the water, it's an act of due diligence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Ducat and Marshall don their foul weather gear, the 2 missing sets of oilskins, and they descend to the West Landing to check on or secure the equipment.
And now, the trap springs. How does a rogue wave like this materialize in conditions that appear to be only a moderate breeze?
Well, rogue waves are not usually born in local storms. They're often the result of complex wave interactions happening far out to sea. It could be constructive interference where multiple swells combine their energy, or it could be rapid changes in the ocean depth focusing wave energy.
So these were likely long-period swells, traveling extremely fast, that were masked by the high cliffs until the very last moment.
That's the most likely scenario. And as this massive, unforeseen volume of water approaches, it enters that narrow geo.
And the hydraulic amplification takes hold immediately.
The water mass is compressed by the narrowing rock walls, converting its speed and volume into instantaneous vertical run-up.
Okay, what happens next involving MacArthur? He's the key to the psychological aspect of this.
MacArthur is likely observing from the compound, which is up at 200 feet. Perhaps he's performing an auxiliary task or just waiting for his colleagues to return. And from his vantage point, he sees the wave, or maybe a set of 3 waves, approaching. He sees a colossal wall of water that is clearly higher than anything they had ever experienced before, maybe over 150 feet high.
And he realizes the immediate existential danger his colleagues are in.
And his reaction is instantaneous. Desperate.
Pure panic.
Yes, he sprints out to warn them, to help them, driven by the code of service and camaraderie. And the absolute proof of his panic is simple. His oilskins are still hanging on the peg. He rushes towards the landing area, not dressed for the elements, and attempts to reach them.
The impact, the wave strikes, the hydrogeological pressure created by the run-up is just unbelievable.
The evidence on the ground confirms the scale. That force tore iron railings from stone, dislodged and carried the 1-ton stone block 100 feet up the cliff face, and swept away the equipment box at 110 feet.
𝐏𝐿𝐃 and Marshall, down near the landing. They would have been struck by the leading edge.
They would have been instantly overwhelmed. And MacArthur, caught higher up by the violent surge, would have lost his footing on the slick, now impossible surface.
And the reason we never found any trace of them.
A wave of that magnitude and velocity ensures utter disappearance. The backwash would drag the men instantly into the deep, turbulent currents surrounding the isle. The Atlantic reclaimed them entirely, ensuring no bodies, no scraps of clothing, nothing ever returned to the surface.
This single hypothesis perfectly explains all 3 pieces of forensic evidence. The movement of the 1-ton stone, which requires that high-velocity water, the tidiness of the interior, which confirms a rational departure, and MacArthur's missing gear, which confirms panic and sudden action.
It systematically dismisses every alternative theory. Mercury poisoning doesn't account for the sudden disappearance or the massive external damage. And murder-suicide fails completely. The scene shows no evidence of struggle, the men were highly reliable, and the missing gear indicates an orderly, work-related exit by 2 of them.
The stark, terrifying reality is that they were not claimed by madness or ghosts, but by an extreme yet predictable act of physics and topography.
So the Flannan Isles tragedy is this powerful, almost classical example of the elemental overpowering the engineered. Those 3 conscientious keepers were claimed by the North Atlantic, victims of a specific and terrifying hydrogeological phenomenon, the amplification of swell in that unforgiving geo.
And yet it's the mythology that endures. We've just proven the facts, but the fiction still holds all the power.
Because the myths offers a satisfying narrative, a psychological drama we can process. We prefer the tale of the overturned chair and the men descending into madness, the idea that it was human frailty or some spectral agency.
We prefer that over the bleak truth that 3 capable men were simply overpowered by a random force of indifferent nature that exceeded the engineering parameters of their station.
It's a failure of technology against physics, not a failure of character against isolation. And that lack of narrative control, the realization that they died a meaningless death by water, is what the human mind resists. The mystery persists because we crave a better answer than random catastrophe.
The disaster, however, it did force real, lasting change in how these beacons of safety were operated.
It did. It highlighted the catastrophic risk of relying on visual signaling and a single human observer 20 miles away. The Flannan Isles disaster directly contributed to the accelerated adoption of wireless telegraphy across Scottish and British lighthouses.
They realized they needed a technological failsafe.
An electronic one.
Yeah.
A way to report an outage immediately was now seen as absolutely essential.
So it was a crucial, tragic step on the long march toward automation.
Precisely. Automation, which is the final triumph of engineering over the need for human presence in these hostile environments. It finally addressed the isolation problem that claimed 𝐏𝐿𝐃, Marshall, and MacArthur. Today, Eilean Mor is automated. Its light is turned by machines, finally leaving the domain of the spirits and the immense, unexpected waves to rest.
So we know the facts now. They're rigorously laid out by the archival evidence and the oceanographic science. But here is something for you to mull over as you go about your day. We have verified evidence of what happened, a natural catastrophe explained by physics. Yet, why do we as humans so often actively prefer the dramatic fiction of a psychological mystery, the idea of instability or ghostly forces, over the verifiable yet less narratively satisfying truth of indifferent natural violence?
It suggests that sometimes the most disturbing reality is that there is no hidden killer, no grand mystery, and no one left to blame but the uncompromising sea itself.